Hello, RENSEP, and welcome back to our series on interviews to scholars and practitioners. In this case, we have a scholar, an academic, so that we can have a better understanding of esoteric practices. And today I have here for you Dr. Monika Hirmer. Hello, Monika. How are you today?
Hi, Angela. Thank you for having me. I'm very well today. I'm glad to be here with RENSEP.
Yeah, I'm glad that you are here with us because you have very, very interesting research. So, first of all, let's start with your introduction. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yes. So my name is Monika Hirmer, and I am currently a research fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies. The project is called Alternative Rationalities and Esoteric Practices from a Global Perspective. And in this project, I look at Tantra in the West, in a cross-cultural perspective, though, comparing it with some of my work that I have done on Sri Vidya in South Asia. Yeah, and this is a project that is therefore building a lot on my earlier research and on some fieldwork that I could do this summer in the UK, primarily thanks to generous sponsorship of RENSEP.
And you got your PhD at SOAS, right?
Yes.
What is your academic background?
So my latest, the PhD is in religions and philosophies from SOAS, University of London. Before that, I did an MPhil in anthropology of religion at the University of Hyderabad in South India. So I'm an anthropologist, but then I always work at the intersection of anthropology, philosophy, religious studies, and always try to bring in a decolonial lens.
That's great. So let's start with our topic. What is Sri Vidya and what are the main practices of this tradition?
Okay, so Sri Vidya is one of the tantric traditions. It revolves around the beautiful, benevolent, motherly and erotic goddess Tripura Sundari. Tripura Sundari is the origin and the end of everything existing and yet to exist, both in a manifest as well as in a transcendental form. So she's the absolute. And she can appear in a number of guises. Anthropomorphically, she is a very beautiful lady who is represented very often sitting on top of her consort Shiva, with whom she is in blissful sexual union. Then we have her diagrammatic form, which is the Sri Chakra. I have one here I can show you. This is a diagram made of 9 different levels where you have interlocking triangles and lotus petals. And one of my primary teachers would call it the genetic code of the cosmos. And I think that is a very apt way of thinking about it. And finally, Tripura Sundari also can manifest as the powerful Panchadasi mantra, which is a mantra of 15 syllables and the most subtle form that the goddess takes. And then we also have to say that since she is all-pervasive, she's in the beginning and end of everything, she therefore is also in every one of us. Each one of us is considered a manifestation of her. And this manifests through a tripartite superimposition between the Sri Chakra, the goddess, and our bodies. So there are the chakras, these energy knots that show this oneness, ultimate oneness with everything. And the main aim of Sri Vidya is exactly to become aware of this oneness with Devi. Devi is the goddess. Because this awareness of one's own divinity gives powers to the practitioners with which to influence worldly affairs, but at the same time, it allows liberation, moksha. And there are a number of ways, of practices, of rituals, and spiritual paths through which this oneness can be acknowledged. The most conventional one is the Dakshinachara path, where the goddess is worshipped in her anthropomorphic form, with flowers, incense, mantras, these more conventional offerings, which are then given to her in an idol form. Then we have the Samayachara path, which is celebrating the superimposition between oneself and the goddess through visualizations and rituals with the help of yantras, which are mandalas, basically. Then we have the Kaulachara path, which is revolving around practitioners' pleasure. Because as we saw, practitioners are Devi, are the goddess, therefore their own pleasure is directly giving Devi, the goddess, pleasure. And finally, we have the Vamachara path, which instead revolves around the so-called impure, very powerful Panchamakara substances. But this one is used only in very extreme, very exceptional circumstances, at least at the temple where I was living and got initiated into Sri Vidya. It's also important to note, to keep in mind that practitioners do practice different rituals belonging to the different paths in an organic way. So certain circumstances need a ritual of the, say, Kaulachara path, whereas others, for other circumstances, a Dakshinachara type of ritual is more appropriate. So there is a fluidity integrated within Sri Vidya, and only the Kaulachara part and the Vamachara part, the last two, are considered by the practitioners I lived with tantric. So this is.
So does it mean that there are others that are not tantric? They are not considered tantric?
It's very difficult to to put a definition to these things, but by and large, yes, by and large, the Dakshinachara and the Vamachara, Dakshinachara and Samayachara path, the one more on the visualizations and with more conventional idol worship, they are not directly considered tantric by most of the practitioners I lived with. Yeah. But again, it's very fluid. So then, because the same practitioner may, perform rituals from the different paths, it's then again very difficult to say who is a tantrika and who is not a tantrika. So I try to stay away from too fixed definitions, because that's always problematic. Yeah,
I understand that. And what inspired you to conduct research on Sri Vidya practices in Western contexts? Because you also researched that in Western context. You will tell us a bit more about that. And how did your previous research on Sri Vidya in South Asia inform this project?
Yeah. So, okay, my interest in Tantra in the West, of course, builds on my engagement with Sri Vidya in India, where I lived for almost a decade and was immediately fascinated by the powerful goddesses that populate the pantheon there. So that's why I then did my MPhil and PhD on in religion and on Sri Vidya in South Asia. And then when coming back to London to finish my PhD, I started getting interested in the same traditions, or what is called tantric traditions in the West, because I saw that there was a large offer, that increasing offer in tantric workshops, temple nights, courses, different courses on tantra, and retreats, festivals. So that piqued my curiosity, because we have the same name, but then I wanted to also the same name Tantra, and I wanted to see what that means in the different contexts. So I started to try to bring into conversation the two different practices, how it's in South Asia and how it is practiced in the West. So I did see that there are quite a few differences, and which brought me then to want to explore the why. Why is it that these practices are different in the different contexts, rather than only observing that they are different? And like, what are the existential frameworks? What are the cosmological backgrounds that inform the differences in the practices? So this is a little bit how I came to look at Tantra in both contexts, South Asia and the West, and bringing them into this conversation with each other.
And so can you tell us a bit more about specific Sri Vidya traditions, teachers, and communities that you engage with during your fieldwork in the UK? Because I know that you've done fieldwork in the UK. So how did you gain access to them, and specifics about the traditions, the teachers, the communities?
Yeah. So yeah, the type of access is already where we see one of these big differences between how Tantra is practiced and perceived in the West from how it is perceived in South Asia. In South Asia, the goddess is worshipped freely, like for free. You can go to a temple and offer your worship to Devi, and it is done many times collectively. You join collective worship. So, and this is how you get into the community, how then the rapport with the informants is established and nurtured. In the West, instead, it was a little bit more difficult, because in a Western context, I found the tantric practices to be more confined within a specific space and time, because there is most of these tantra courses or tantra festivals and so are accessible only upon payment. So I joined a few studios and yoga and tantra schools in London, and also something online based in the West. And this is the type of how I encountered Tantra in the West, and the type of rapport that I could establish in the West with the practitioners and teachers, therefore, was quite different, because it is more, I guess, less fluid, because it is confined to certain spaces.
And what about the different traditions, the different practices that you have encountered?
You mean in terms of the continuities between, like?
We will discuss that later. I meant more in terms of more specifics about the specific traditions and practices that you have encountered in the UK, and how they relate, perhaps.
Yeah, so there can be some stark differences between each school of Tantra. So it's very difficult to pinpoint at what is it that makes a certain tradition particular or different from others in the West, as well as in South Asia. So yeah, I mean, I followed certain schools, which again, I went to the first one because I saw the Shri Chakra, which for me was a very familiar symbol. So I was attracted to that, and this is the one that I followed most. And and a few online and temple nights as well. But again, the offer is so vast, and the time is limited, so I cannot really go much beyond the ones that I have encountered.
Okay, so what were some of the continuities that you observed between Sri Vidya practices in South Asia versus Western context? What were some key differences or transformations that you found?
Of course, there are several continuities and common denominators. The most obvious one is the terminology. We speak of Tantra in both contexts, although what is meant by that can differ significantly. There is also an underlying aim to find happiness, enjoyment, and fulfillment I think that is predominant. That is the ultimate question in both of the contexts. We have also a common symbology. As I said, the Sri Chakra, for example, I have found it in both contexts, as well as the chakras, the energy knots. But the way in which one works with them changes from, again, not only between South Asia and the West, but also, again, within the different schools in the West and in India or South Asia, respectively. Now, when it comes to the differences, there are numerous differences, which I cannot all list here, but I would say that overall they can be reconduced to the different socio-political frameworks that we live in. So in the West, we have a majority of our lives is governed, informed by a capitalist framework. So we see, for example, money playing an important role in the access of tantric workshops, schools, rituals, and so on. Whereas, as we saw in South Asia, there is you can go for free to a temple and worship. This also then the capitalist framework that we have in the West is, of course, not exclusive. Also in India and South Asia, people live against a backdrop which is capitalist. However, we can see that the demands of the market are always negotiated with the demands of the goddess. So rituals don't only happen, say, for example, in the evening or on the weekend, which is how it is usually in the West. So they happen conveniently after one's 9-to-5 job, for example. But in South Asia, the when to perform rituals is determined by the goddess and also by the motion of the stars and the planets. So it's not only the market that decides which rituals and when the rituals are performed, but there is this negotiation between capitalism and the Sri Vidya cosmological framework. And another great difference, I would say, that I noticed is that in the West, these tantric practices are very often embedded within a larger wellness industry that aims at the psychophysical well-being of the practitioner. So next to Tantra, we see that you have workshops on Reiki or massage, astrology, dance, many different things are being offered. Whereas in the South Asian context, as we saw, the tantric paths are part of the larger Sri Vidya tradition, which then embeds the tantric practices within the goddess worship at large, which in turn is embedded within the larger Hindu framework. So yeah, I would say that the various differences can be really, to a large extent, be drawn back to these differences in the, I would say, metaphysical cosmological frameworks.
Is there also a difference in terms of the dominant religion of the place? I mean, is there, because you mentioned the negotiation that has to do with capitalism and the workforce. I mean, the fact that people have to work at specific hours. But is there a negotiation happening also in terms of religion? Because, for people that are somewhat imbued in a culture that is shaped heavily by Christianity, speaking of Western countries like, well, the UK probably is not the best example, but yeah, I was just wondering whether there was an influence from other religions as well in a Western context.
Yeah, this is something that I plan to explore more. And so far, though, I must say that I have encountered several people who have resorted to Tantra in order to find answers that Christianity, for example, was not giving them, or in order to also overcome certain limitations that were imposed implicitly, so to say, by a Christian narrative or a certain type of Christian narrative that informs a lot of the everyday life. So it's not only capitalism, of course, but yeah, these are things that I will explore further in the next months.
That's very interesting. And what can a cross-cultural comparative perspective reveal about the adaptation of an historic tradition like Shrividya across different regional contexts? What does it say about esotericism more broadly, in your view?
Yeah, okay. So I think a cross-cultural comparative perspective can be the most fruitful when we don't only look at what makes the practices or traditions different, but as I mentioned earlier, when we look at why they are different. Because when we look at the why, we can really start seeing or exploring, investigating what are the underpinning existential framework, underpinning elementary notions of beingness. And by that, I mean the understanding of the body, the understanding of what it means to be female or male or mother, guru, and so on and so forth. In different cultures, we have, of course, different understandings of these elementary notions of beingness, which need different types of rituals. So if a certain ritual were transposed into a different culture without being adapted and transformed, it could be that it loses its efficacy. So by looking at how the rituals are different in the different contexts, we can then go back to seeing what are the different understandings of the body or of motherhood or like whatever you are most interested in. So I think this is where the cross-cultural perspective can really be used to its most fruitful way. And then when it comes to the larger discourse around esotericism, I think that, again, a cross-cultural perspective can really help us to relativize the idea of what is esoteric and what instead is mainstream. Because very often there is still, unfortunately, an implicit underpinning narrative that is dominated by Eurocentric frameworks, which then makes us assume that a certain understanding of the body is universalizable. But again, a cross-cultural perspective where we see that the same ritual needs different adaptations in different contexts really can show us that the bodies on which they are performed or through which these rituals are performed are different, and therefore they really need to be treated differently. They need to be worshipped differently. So I think that this cross-cultural perspective helps us to not marginalize, but provincialize Europe and provincialize the mainstream Western understandings of what is esoteric and what is mainstream, what is at the center and what is at the margins. So I think this is where it also can fulfill a very important decolonial aim of, sort of.
I thought,
These
yeah,
dynamics.
I was thinking, you said that if a practice gets imported in another culture and is not reshaped by that culture, it might lose its efficacy. Why do you think that is? Because people tend to think the opposite. They tend to think that the most accurate they are in respecting a certain tradition, the way it, it's been done for centuries or millennia, then the most effective it will be. So why do you think that not translating it into the cultural fabric of the place where it's been important would make it lose efficacy?
I think this brings us to the important conversation around origins and authenticity. And I would say it's a little bit of a mirage, this idea of an authentic and original practice. Because even in South Asia, it's very difficult to define Tantra. Different scholars, different practitioners have different ideas around what it is. And as we saw also within Sri Vidya, there are these four parts which merge and then change a little bit and overlap. So um, I don't think there is any fixated original ritual which can be translated one by one into another culture, because it has never been one original authentic ritual. And very often there is the tendency to attribute most authority to ancient texts when it comes to Tantra and other Hindu traditions, which are primarily written in Sanskrit, and they were written by a very specific group of people, mainly male Brahmins from the priestly caste, which therefore means that those rituals were not necessarily relatable by the larger population. They don't often know Sanskrit. So the perception, the philosophy behind it, and also the way of putting them into practice may also change, may also have been different from the text already in ancient India. So again, this is really showing, I think, that we have constructed a little bit this myth, this idea of an authentic origin. So I think it makes perfect sense that if even within a context like South Asia, the ritual changes over time, it makes perfect sense that when it is coming to a Western context, it is changing yet again.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and of course, I agree with the fact that it is a bit of a myth. The idea of authenticity, it's something that it's quite prevailing among practitioners, but I think that scholars are very much aware of that. So yeah, it does make sense that there is a transformation that happens when something is incorporated in a different culture. But what I was wondering is, why did you think that uh, not making that transformation would make it lose efficacy? That was the point that I thought was interesting to explain.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, sorry. I noticed that in South Asia, when I was doing my research there, that when some rituals were transformed, because even there is a continuous transformation, as we said, they stopped having efficacy for some people. So I would assume that the same happens also when it happens that a certain ritual is not transformed and adapted to, in this case, in the Western context, we have a very, to a certain extent, our understanding of gender changes very much. We have also a tendency to highlight the dichotomies between what is male and what is female. Whereas in Sri Vidya in South Asia, how I lived it there is this underpinning femininity, this underpinning femaleness. So even a male is addressed as amma, as mother, and also motherhood is not only a biological term, because everyone becomes a mother the moment they identify with Devi, who is this origin and end of everything. So you understand then that when the same ritual is practiced in a Western context where people don't necessarily know how to relate to a female male, who is not effeminate or so, but really a male who becomes a mother. This is a different concept. This is a concept that is not easily relatable to in certain contexts. So I think that this is explaining why a ritual that then does not take into account the local contextual notions of beingness may lose its efficacy, or may just become so obscure that the interest in it is lost or something, just not relatable, and therefore not efficacious.
That's really interesting. Thank you. That was a point that I never quite thought about. So that really gave me food for thought, for sure. And so how did your participatory fieldwork and observant participation in rituals workshops inform your understanding of Srividya? And what insights did you gain through embodied experience, embodied practice?
Yeah, okay. So my choice to look at Trividya through an embodied practice is very much rooted in my desire to approach Srividya and Devi in a way that is as similar as possible to that of the practitioners I lived with. And as we saw before, not everyone speaks, not everyone knows Sanskrit. So not everyone goes back to these ancient texts. In fact, there are also several unlettered people whom I was together at the temple. So the approach to the tradition is really from the start an embodied approach. It's an approach that where people learn the rituals by collectively participating, by living with other teachers, with other practitioners, with the guru. So this is something that I really wanted to recreate. But also it really was the way that my teachers also encouraged me to do. So in the beginning of my fieldwork in South Asia, in India, I still attempted several times to go for interviews, to ask my teachers very specific questions. And they would very often then reply and say something like, you Westerners, you have so many questions. You always ask questions. We Indians, we don't ask. We just do, you know? So I also was encouraged to just do, to go to the temple, sit next to Devi, and then the answers would come. This is what I was told. And so this is how I approached Srividya and how I learned about it. And I really hope that this is as close as possible to how my friends and teachers there have approached it. And I call this fieldwork as dwelling, which really entails a profound enmeshment within the context being studied. It really requires disorienting deconstruction of the concepts that we spoke about earlier, such as the body and father, mother, male, female, and so on. Because only then can the contextual notions of body, gender, and so on become organically relatable to by the researcher as well. Only once the original understandings of the body have been deconstructed can a male who is also a mother, can a male who is also a female become organically relatable to. Okay, so this is what informed my research, my fieldwork in South Asia. But of course, it was very difficult. It is very difficult to reproduce this in the Western context because we saw that the space is much more confined. There is money involved, which means that the encounter with teachers, fellow practitioners, and students is, again, it's confined, it's structured. Whereas in India, I was living with the same 15 to 20 people in a very, in the temple complex for over a year. So there was no, it was all very fluid. What is a mundane activity versus what is a ritual activity? When are you, worshipping Devi, and when are you instead just doing an auspicious activity? So all of this is really fluid in my experience in South Asia, but I could unfortunately not recreate that type of fieldwork experience in the West, which then of course changes also the type of rapport that you can establish with teachers and students.
That's very interesting. And how do you think your work contributes to RENSEP's mission to advance the study of esoteric practices from a global interdisciplinary perspective? And what insights does it offer?
Okay, I think that my work could probably my work is probably very different in terms of because of the positionality that I occupy. As a white woman who has been very generously made to feel at home at the temple complex in South Asia, I could be integrated into the local cosmological framework, which impacted me very much. So this, because I lived in India for almost 10 years, of which more than a year at the temple, coming to the West was from a different perspective from what a lot of other researchers, from how other researchers approach Tantra in the West. So I think that this can add a decolonial perspective, and because my first impact with Western Tantra was quite disorienting and to an extent also alienating. So this perspective really, I think, can help reverse a little bit the center margin dynamics that inform a lot of the knowledge production on West and South Asia, and so which are still entrenched in Eurocentric paradigms. So I think that this type of reverse perspective can, I hope at least, it can contribute to unsettling a little bit these macrodynamic power balances. Yeah. So. I cannot hear you.
So sorry.
I think you were muted.
Yeah. I was saying good point. And so
I think that I hope that this is where also my decolonial approach comes into the picture quite prominently, and I think that this is also what we really need in the study of esoteric practices more generally, and this is where I hope to be able to contribute.
And one final question: what are some directions for future research on Srividya or other tantric traditions in Western context that you would recommend?
I would recommend continuing to shift from the attention to texts towards instead more focus on praxis, because this is how practitioners relate to the practices, what informs their everyday life. And therefore, it's also really refreshing to see an initiative such as RENSEP, where you have this bringing together of scholars and practitioners. So I really like this direction, and I would hope to see more of it. And the other thing, of course, that I just say is I would advocate a decolonial approach, in an approach that is proactively engaged in dismantling fixed notions of what is esoteric and what is mainstream, of what is the center and what is the margins. Because we have a lot of centuries of violent dichotomizations and hierarchizations to undo, and to be able to relativize what it means to be at the center and at the margin, to be able to see that when looked at from a South Asian perspective, what a Westerner would consider esoteric is not considered esoteric in the South Asian perspective. I think that this is what can help us to overcome these centuries of still colonial dynamics.
Yeah, that's well said. I agree with you that it is very important to work on decolonizing and the Eurocentrize. That's not even a word, to make the study of historicism not Eurocentric.
Yes.
So yeah, these are very, very important concepts. So where can people find you if they want to know more about your research?
On my academia page as Monika Hirmer. And currently I'm in Erlangen at the Center for Advanced Studies I was mentioning earlier on esoteric practices from a global perspective. And yeah, some publications are out there for you to Google if you want, and more to come soon, hopefully.
Mm,
Yeah.
fantastic. Best of luck with your research, Monica.
Thank you so much. It means a lot.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the interview.
Thank you for having me.
So this is it, guys, and I hope that you enjoyed this interview. I most certainly did. And if you have any questions, let's start a discussion on the forum on the RENSEP platform. So as for now, RENSEP over and out. Until next time, stay esoteric.